Hello, welcome to Chapmanomics with me, Mr. Chapman. In this lesson, we are going to start looking at our first country to do with economic growth and economic development, and that is going to be Zambia. In our past couple of lessons, we have looked at the basics, the stuff that we need to recap when it comes to economic growth and development, looking at the difference between economic growth and economic development. Growth, remember, all about producing more as an economy, outputting more. Development, all about standards of living, about how we measure development using the HDI and the three factors that go into HDI, but also looking at demand side and supply side policies. If you've not already watched that video, go back and watch the first video. Otherwise, maybe some of this won't make sense to you. Then we looked at why economists care about growth and development. And we looked at this being all about welfare. The more we have economic growth in an economy, the more stuff we produce, the more welfare we hopefully gain, the more we're able to develop an economy, the more standards of living rise, and therefore the more welfare we gain. So in this lesson, as I say, we're going to start looking at a case study so that we can see how this works in action and see each of the factors and strategies that affect growth and development, how they work in practice. So let's get over to the whiteboard and let's take a look. So here we have a case study all about the country of Zambia in Africa. If you don't know where it is, give it a Google, have a look on Google Maps so you have a good idea of where it is. And what I would like you to do is I'd like you to take a moment to pause the video, have a look at this case study and see if you can pull out the key points from it, and then we'll go through it together. So pause that video now. Let's look through it. So for me here, I'm going to start off by just reading the case study and trying to jot down what I think are the key points. Now, I'm always thinking about whether something's going to affect how much output in the economy there is, or whether something's going to affect life expectancy, GNI per capita, or years of education. I'm going to focus on those things. That way I'm focusing on growth and development. So let's start off with our title here. Zambia struggles under weight of copper dependence. Now, I happen to know that copper is a primary product. This is something that we're going to dig out of the ground. This is not something that we're going to be manufacturing. And as a result of that, the price of copper is probably going to be fairly low because you then use copper to produce other goods and services. And as a result, the copper itself has to be a cheaper price than the other goods and services. Otherwise, our firms are just losing money. As a result of that, this could link to a couple of things. This could link potentially to economic growth, as we're looking at quite low value growth, low value economic goods and services here. But it could also lead to development issues as well, because copper comes out of the ground, it's mined out of the ground, which to me says maybe not the healthiest of things to be doing, and so therefore perhaps has an impact on life expectancy as well. So under the weight of copper and under the weight of debt, well, debt is massively going to affect economic growth, because if our government is in significant amounts of debt, it's going to affect that G component of aggregate demand. But this is also likely to affect development too, because of investment into things like health and education. Those things are likely to be lower because we just simply don't have the money to do it. We're in huge amounts of debt, and as a result, paying high levels of interest. Now let's get into the text itself. So I've already got some good context here. Zambia, a landlocked country in Central Africa. So landlocked as well, that's going to give me some ideas about here. We have no ports in the country. So then how do we export successfully? It's a lot harder to get any goods and services around the world if you don't have a port, if you don't have some way of shipping them. Instead, you have to take them via land, which is very slow and relies on you having roads. It's a beautiful landlocked country in Central Africa, a beautiful and diverse country. Managing to avoid the wars and political upheaval that's marked the post-colonial period, Zambia has a reputation for political stability. Okay, so there's no real corruption here, or very low levels of corruption potentially. We'll see what happens looking forward. In the 2000s, the country's economy grew rapidly. Rates averaged 7.7% per year. That's very high. That's interesting. Between 2001 and 2010, so across 10 years, that's a long time, right? They've been really growing very rapidly. They've been getting a lot more money coming into the economy over the course of that 10 years. Let's see what they've done with it. Mainly driven by a boom in copper prices. Okay, so the economy is focused on copper. So that copper that they're mining out the ground is going to be really important for them. Zambia's main export. The mining sector expanded, coming to dominate 1/5 of the country's economy. That's huge, a really large amount of the country's economy, and a full 64%. Again, that's huge of the country's exports. So really, the copper industry in Zambia is dominant here. There's not really a lot else from the look of it that is going on in the country. So therefore, if the price of copper changes significantly, that's going to massively affect growth and or development. The benefits of this growth mainly reached urban areas, so not a lot rural. What happened in the rural population? Reducing poverty in cities with little spread to the countryside. Yeah, so not much going on in the countryside. Maybe high levels of poverty there still. When the commodity boom ended, oh dear. So if this ended, then 1/5 of the economy is starting to really struggle. And 64% of the country's exports are starting to struggle too. It's probably not going brilliantly well for them. So economic growth slowed dramatically, just as we thought. Government services and public investment became the main drivers of economic growth. So G increased rather than potentially X. Now, this is always going to be a problem, because if G's pushing the economy, if G's the only thing growing the economy, government spending, of course, if G's growing the economy, then that means they're having to borrow money here in order to keep that economy growing. They're not getting their money through consumption or through business taxes here. But this relied heavily on public debt, as we thought, to finance the spending, so much so that Zambia defaulted on its bonds. Oh dear. Now, when you default on your bonds are just lending to the government. So instead of the way that maybe we go to a bank and the bank lends us £5,000 and we pay it back a little bit over time, what generally tends to happen with government debt is it's pretty much interest only. So the government might offer, say, £100,000 in debt, and it might say, you give me £100,000 and I'll give you 10% interest. I'll give you 10 grand a year on that debt for the next 10 years. And then after that 10 years is up, I'll give you your £100,000 back. Well, in this case, after that 10-year period was up, the Zambian government said, oh, sorry, can't give you that £100,000 back. So therefore, this is going to mean investor confidence is very low in Zambia. It's very, very low as a result. If you don't think you're going to get your money back, you're going to charge the government a lot more in interest. And so effectively the country here, as it says, has gone bankrupt. As a result, efforts to reduce poverty have stalled, and roughly 60% of the population, goodness me, that's a lot of people, live below the poverty line. In a country of 20 million people, now we can do a nice calculation here. If we have 60% of 20 million people, we can do that calculation. So 10% is going to be equal to 2 million, times that by 6, and we get 12 million. So 12 million people in this country are living in poverty. It's a great bit of application there. And there's only 451 secondary schools, so therefore this is going to mean low levels of education in Zambia. If there's only 451 secondary schools for 20 million people, if we assume that even something like a quarter of those people, so 5 million people, are kids, there's only 451 secondary schools for them all to go to. It's not a huge amount. Jobs are mostly focused on the agricultural sector. So again, this sort of suggests that low levels of education, potentially. Skills are low. Productivity is declining as a result, because you get diminishing returns to land. As you add more labor to the land doesn't actually get any better. You're not using it any more productively. As you keep adding labor, you've just got more people working the same land. And in fact, usually, talking agriculture, the land gets worse when that happens. Declining productivity rates in rural areas due to lack of skilled workers is directly contributing to a rise in poverty. So here we've got development issues as wages remain depressed. So here we're talking about GNI per capita being low. Very low. The services sector has fared a little better. So here we've not got much industry. And the country struggled to develop labour-intensive industries, and there you go again, in the secondary and tertiary sectors, as the public sector's higher wages attract skilled labour. So there's a huge amount going on within this extract. But what I'm thinking now, having gone through it and written all this stuff down, is there's a few key points here. The first one is that this is a country that is completely dependent on its copper, which is a primary product. And it was great in the boom times, but it is not so good when the boom ended. And because the country is so dependent on it, because 64% of the country's exports and 1/5 of the country's economy is dependent on copper, if things have gone bad in the copper industry, then economic growth is going to suffer significantly, and also probably economic development is going to suffer significantly because the government's not going to receive tax money in order to invest in things like education and healthcare. Remember, always focusing development points on HDI. So therefore, a huge amount of information within our first extract here. Okay, let's see if we can get some more information from some key statistics. So again, here's our table giving us some information about Zambia, maybe some ideas about growth and development. Have a look at this figure and see if you can come up with the key points. Then we'll go through it together. Pause the video now. Let's look through it. So what I'm thinking here is internet subscribers per 100 people. Only 0.5 people have access to the internet now. To me, this is going to cause issues with education and healthcare. This is going to be particularly something to do with skills here, and particularly things to do with healthcare. You know, if you have a problem with your health, you generally go straight to Google and start looking up whatever the problem might be. If you are looking to learn something, then usually you go and Google it. But if you don't have access to the internet, you're not going to be able to do that. So therefore, there's going to be an issue with skills in the economy that might link to growth, and issues with healthcare in the economy might link particularly to development. Here, when it comes to these internet subscribers. Number of citizens with a bank account per 100 people is only 21. That feels very, very low indeed. So therefore you can't borrow if you don't have a bank account. And therefore consumption is likely to be very low, which links to economic growth, of course, because consumption is one part of AD. So AD here is probably likely to be very constrained. People are not borrowing to buy cars and buy houses because they don't have a bank account to do so. Then also we have our debt to GDP ratio, which is very, very high. So this is high levels of debt here, which probably means high levels of debt interest. And if we look at this down here, the share of the budget deficit as a percentage of GDP, 6.6%, I bet quite a lot of that is debt interest. So therefore there's limited scope for government intervention, because they simply don't have the money to do it. If you're spending a huge amount of your tax money on debt interest, that is money that is not going towards supply side policy, demand side policy from the government, but it's also not money that's going into education and healthcare either, so it's going to affect development and growth there. Debt interest payments as a share of GDP, well, as we thought, 3.2%, that's very, very high. 3.2% of everything the country produces is going away to investors, probably international investors, if we're being honest here. And then the percentage of population in rural areas, that's 53%. Now, if these people are in rural areas, these are a lot of the people who are in poverty, as we saw before. And also, if these people in rural areas, there's a bit of a stereotype that you can put in place here. If these are agricultural jobs, so people in farms who are picking crops, for instance, then they're potentially low skilled work. And as a result, maybe education levels in rural areas are not particularly high because they almost don't need to be. If you are picking strawberries, for instance, then you just need the skills to be able to pick strawberries. You don't need to necessarily have learnt how to read and write in order to pick strawberries, as long as you've got someone who can tell you how to do it, for instance. Okay, let's have a final look at figure 2, Zambia's growth rate and the international copper price. So Zambia's growth rate here is in our dotted line that looks like this, and the copper price here is in our bars here. So see if you can have a look at this data, and again, try and pick out the key points. So pause the video, try and pick out some key points, jot them down, and then we'll go through it together. Let's have a look. So whenever I see any kind of data like this, whenever I see a bar graph or I see a line graph, I always like to do lines of best fit. So I will do Zambia's GDP growth rate in blue, and I will do the copper price here in red. So line of best fit for our copper price, our growth rate, it goes down, it goes up, and then it flatlines. There's about our line of best fit. Then if we look at the copper price, it goes down, it goes up, and then it sort of flatlines here. If we look at these two, our red is basically equal to our blue, which therefore means there must be here a strong connection or correlation, as we usually call it in economics. There's a strong correlation between the two. There's a good chance that one might be causing the other. And in this case, it's probably our copper price that is causing our GDP growth rate. And in fact, if we go back to the extract, that's more or less what we're told. So this is sort of proving it with a bit more data. And what we're told here in the extract is 1/5 of the country's economy and 64% of the country's exports come from copper. And that's more or less the kind of relationship that we have going on here. So a huge amount of information then that comes from the information here. So what I'd like you to do now is pause the video and see if you can answer these two questions. So which aspects of Zambia's economy might be constraining its economic growth, and which aspects of Zambia's economy might be constraining its economic development? Pause the video and give those two questions a go now. Let's have a look through this together. So the aspects of Zambia's economy that might be constraining its growth, well, it's dependency on primary products, and I'm going to call this primary product dependency, because we have 64% of exports and 1/5 of the economy. That's huge. This is maybe an economy that needs to diversify away from being focused on primary products, because if, as you saw in the extract, when there's a boom time, things are great. But when that boom is over, things are then pretty terrible for the economy. It's too dependent on those primary products. Then maybe another thing that's preventing it from growing too much is the skills in the economy, particularly in rural areas, where there's lots of people who are in poverty, and therefore they're likely to not have a very high education level. And so maybe there's some constraints going on there with our skills in rural areas. And the final one, I think, is industrialization. I think there's a big issue here with a lack of secondary industry. Because if there were secondary industries, if there were significant secondary industries in the economy, then it would mean the economy diversifies away from this over here, this primary product dependency. And also you need to develop the skills of your workforce in order to produce secondary products. And so therefore it could solve a couple of those problems. So there's a lack of secondary industry here constraining their growth rate. In terms of their development, their economic development, well, there's high levels of poverty. Now, poverty is going to have a massive impact on health and education, as well as average incomes, which is what we're looking at kind of through GNI per capita. So poverty is going to have a massive impact on economic development through these three features. So if we think about someone who's in poverty and health, if you can't afford healthcare, you can't afford education, and then because you're in poverty, you haven't got a high level of income anyway. So poverty is going to be a real issue here. You've also got the rural-urban divide. That is going to cause some problems here. So again, with things like healthcare, with things like GNI per capita. GNI per capita is likely to be higher in urban areas than it is in rural areas. And therefore, as a result, you're likely to see differences in HDI between rural and urban areas. And then another factor that is going to definitely affect their economic growth and their economic development, as we saw up here, is this level of debt, right? This is so significant that these debt interest payment is so high. It means the government can't spend very much money on healthcare and on education. So debt levels is going to massively affect health and education. This is going to be mostly GNI per capita. So there are a number of key features here about the Zambian economy that is going to affect their levels of economic growth and their economic development, and it's going to constrain them. And what we're going to do in our next lesson is we're going to use our Zambia case study here to focus on the theory behind a number of these constraints on growth and development. But we always want to keep in mind that we're looking at real countries here. And so therefore we want to try to apply that knowledge to a real country. And so we're going to first focus off by looking at primary product dependency. So I'll see you in that video.